So when you see a person, the first thing you do instantly is encode their face. This is how you know whether that thing standing in front of you is another human being, and it's the first step toward forming a social connection. It starts with information entering the retina, moving back to the visual cortex in the back of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that tries to make sense of what's standing in front of your eyes. Within 170 milliseconds of seeing that person, this information goes to another part of the brain, the fusiform gyrus. And this part of the brain is what determines whether that thing is a human face. There are all types of faces, all types of people that we encounter in everyday life from different kinds of categories. And what my research shows is that even at this very early visual component of social perception, social categories can influence how we see. So it even happens when the categories are arbitrary. So imagine these two people. You might just say, here's two white men. One is from the green group, one's from the blue group. One of the studies that we did in my lab had people come in, these are participants, and we led them to believe that they were part of a certain group. And we had them view pictures of people from their group or another group while we measured their brain activity. And what we found was even at this very early stage of visual perception, people were processing faces of the in-group member more strongly as face-like than faces of out-group members. It's almost as if they saw in-group members as more human than out-group members. And this was extremely arbitrary. Now imagine other types of groups. When we move from arbitrary groups to things like race, it gets more complicated. Something like race is entrenched in conflict, prejudices, disparities. And we find in several studies that that it depends, how we see people from different races depends a lot on who's in power, whether there's competition, and what a perceiver's goals are. In the work that I want to mention now, well, it represents one way that we wanted to look at this, to try to connect this to issues in the economy. So what we know is that when certain economic factors can affect the way that we deal with people from other groups. One example is that when there's an economic recession, we find that disparities in employment that typically exist between whites, Latinos, and blacks tend to expand even further. And so we, in this line of work, wanted to try to connect these ideas about social perceptions and categories to try to understand perhaps one of the ways that economic factors like this, like an economic recession, a scarcity, can change the way we deal with people from other groups. And one of the initial studies we did, we brought subjects into the laboratory. These are white participants now, because we're interested in race effects with whites and blacks. And we told them we're going to play an allocation game. So this means you're going to get some money, you're going to divide it between two people. And subjects were told they might be either the allocator or the recipient in this game. But we made it so that everybody was assigned to be an allocator. This put them in the mindset that they're going to be dividing up resources. Then we gave them information about how much money they would have to allocate. So in the control condition, they saw a chart, it looked like a pie chart, and we said the total pool of money here is $10. The graphic moved around, it stopped at the full pie. They learned you're going to have the total amount, $10 out of $10 to allocate. But subjects who were randomly assigned to the scarcity condition saw something different. They saw a pie that was representing $100. The graphic moved around, it stopped at only 10% of that. They were told you only get 10 out of $100 to allocate. And we found in our pre-testing that this made people feel like resources were scarce. Okay, so now they're getting ready to make their allocation decisions, where we say, before you do that, do this other task for us. And actually, this is our main outcome measure of interest. And I'll walk you through it to give you an idea. I think it's cool. But where we're getting at is we wanted to figure out, when people are in a scarcity mindset, does the way they imagine a person from another category, in this case, black people, does that change? Do they see blacks differently in their mind compared with when they're not in a scarce situation? And so here's how we created stimuli to do this kind of task. We made a morph of 100 black faces and 100 white faces into one single biracial base face. That's what we called it, the base face. And on top of this single face, we created a lot of new stimuli. We layered on random patterns of visual noise onto this base image to create subtle variations in the features. Do you see that? So they look subtly different, even though it's the same face underneath. And we created 400 different pairs of stimuli like this. And on every trial for this classification task, we ask subjects to simply look at the two images and and just say which is a black person. All right, and so what the inference here, and we've done this not just with race, with a lot of different other kind of categories, but in this context, to address this question, which face is a black person? And what we're assuming here is that they have a representation of what a black face looks like, and this is going to guide their decisions in every trial. Like I said, they do this 400 times. And once they're done, we take all of the faces that they chose as the black face of the pair, remove that base image from underneath it, so just have now the noise patterns on top. We create an average of these things into one composite. All right, so that's the individual's idiosyncratic noise that they chose. Put the base image back under it, and this gives us a visual rendering of what each subject seemed to have in their mind when they thought black person. We do this for all the subjects in both conditions, and we averaged those images together within the condition. So now what we have are representations of a black face in the scarcity condition as well as in the control condition. Now, they look pretty similar because they're coming from that same base image, but subtly different. And now we want to know if this subtle difference is enough to elicit different reactions from other people. So we showed these images now to a brand new sample of subjects. They had no idea where these faces came from. All we wanted to do is ask them to rate them. How dark is this person's skin tone? And how stereotypically black is this person? We asked these things because other research showed that African Americans with darker skin tone or with more Afrocentric features are subjected to more discrimination. And so again, our question is whether under scarcity, in times of scarcity, do people visualize outgroup members, in this case minority groups in America, in a way that might promote discrimination toward them? We're really trying to get under the skin and figure out what is driving some discrimination. As we suspected, people judge this scarcity face, the one on the left, as significantly darker in skin tone, even though when you go pixel by pixel, there's no difference in the actual luminosity. And they also rated it as more stereotypical looking. Next, we wanted to see if this subtle variation that was created in people's mental representations of faces was enough to elicit different kinds of behaviors, different kinds of money allocations. So we went to yet another sample. Again, they had no idea where these faces came from. And we asked them to look at these faces and just try to form an impression about this person. This is something that's not unusual in social psychology studies. But in this case, we have them look at them and try to form an impression of how deserving the person appears, okay? And then we asked, how would you split $15 between these people if you were interacting with them in whole dollars? What we found, again, as we were suspecting, is that people gave significantly less money to the person depicted by the black face produced under scarcity compared with the control face. What was more striking to me, at least, was when we broke it down to individual subjects' allocations. This is a frequency histogram showing now subject by subjects how they split the money. What you see is that everybody tried to be egalitarian, just about. They tried to split that $15 up as equally as possible. They gave $7 to one person, $8 to the other. However, when it came down to that final dollar, it consistently broke in favor of the control group face and against the scarcity group face. So this is an illustration of how even a very subtle difference that categories may produce in the way we perceive people could have some significant consequences when it comes down to a single decision point. Who you hire for that job, who you give funding to, etc. So across those studies, yes, we were beginning to show that economic factors can change the way we perceive people, and this might play a role in producing biases. Let me show you one last study that we did, this quick one. We wanted to see if people might even dehumanize outgroup member faces under times of scarcity. So we brought another set of subjects into the lab. This is a completely different study. Had them do an allocation task, kind of like what I described already. And we measured their brain activity while they did it. And we looked at the time it took them for their brains to encode that what they're looking at is a human face. And I'll show you, let me zoom in on the data of interest. Here's a bar chart showing our results. Now this is depicting how long in the brain it takes for that neural signal of face detection to show up. And in the control condition, people took the same amount of time to encode white and black faces, 170 milliseconds, and that's typical. In the scarcity condition, though, we saw a significant, they were significantly slower in encoding black faces compared with white faces. So in a sense, you could speculate that it's almost making it harder for them to humanize the outgroup face when they're in this economically scarce situation. And then lastly, just to test whether this still subtle, even if it's significant, it's still a subtle effect in the brain might have consequences, we looked at how it related to their allocation decisions in this task, how much money they were giving to the black or white recipients. And we found that economic scarcity led to this impairment in processing black compared with white faces. And to the extent this happened, it produced greater bias in terms of how much money they were giving to white compared with black recipients. So, as you can see, the subtle effects of social categories can sometimes have significant consequences for how we treat other people. And again, this session is about looking at the disconnections, the challenges we have to human connection. This work has demonstrated how quickly we form impressions of people and how social categories can influence the way we do that. That is, to an extent, categories even affect the extent to which we see another person as a human being. And as this relates to the goals of Patch, I think this work demonstrates the fragility of our human connections, and I think it reveals some of the challenges that we face in promoting common humanity. Thanks.